Hey everyone! This week we're going to be discussing descriptive epidemiology, which is something that you'll do from the moment you hear about an outbreak all the way through to creating your outbreak report. This is something that is done iteratively throughout your outbreak, so you're able to keep an up-to-date picture of the outbreak. So early in an outbreak, descriptive epidemiology is what we use to help us generate a hypothesis about the cause of the outbreak, which is something, this hypothesis generation is something we're going to explore in more detail next week. But first, the first step in descriptive epidemiology is developing a good case definition, which is what we're going to be covering in this lecture. So a case definition functions as a standard set of criteria to use in an outbreak investigation to help you decide whether an individual should be classified as being a case associated with your outbreak under investigation. And what we're trying to do is to distinguish those cases from other ill people who are not part of your outbreak, even if maybe they have the same symptoms or a really similar illness. Case definitions are specific to a particular outbreak under investigation. So, for example, even if a single restaurant has maybe had multiple outbreaks, your case definition should be specific to the outbreak you're currently looking at, despite past outbreaks. So a standard case definition helps investigators communicate with each other and ensures that all investigators are counting cases in the same way. So when you're developing your case definition, you want to be sure that if you were to hand that case definition to another one of your classmates or colleagues, they would come to the same conclusion about a person that you're interviewing that you would, based on the case definition alone. A case definition should be presented as a single descriptive sentence and should not be presented as bullet points. Now, every case definition has 4 key components. The first is the clinical findings, and then the next are restrictions by time, place, and person. Clinical criteria refer to some medical findings that are suggestive of the disease and include signs and symptoms of disease and/or laboratory test results, things including subtyping data if available. Restrictions by time, place, and person typically refer to the circumstances around the occurrence of the disease, things like the date of onset of illness or the residence of the case. A case definition should not include the suspected exposure. So if you think the outbreak is linked to people contacting a specific animal or eating a specific food, that animal or food should not be included in your case definition. Because if it is, you can't test that hypothesis. So in developing your case definition, you want the criteria to be as objective as possible and not open to interpretation. So different investigators should be able to apply the same criteria and come up with the same results. You also want the criteria to be discriminating. So you want it to be able to distinguish individuals with the illness associated with the outbreak from individuals with other diseases or even the same disease, but who are not associated with the outbreak investigation. So for example, you want the salmonella cases associated with your restaurant, even if someone else with salmonella presents, but is not a part of your outbreak. So let's start first by looking at this criteria of clinical findings, which are the features of the disease or the illness that people in the outbreak are suffering from. Now, these can include descriptions of the symptoms, such as things like diarrhea and fever, or you may be able to restrict your clinical findings to a specific laboratory diagnosis, such as some culture-positive tests or other tests that confirm the disease. Whether you are including symptoms, laboratory tests, or both in your case definition ultimately relies on what information you have available. For example, if you're investigating an outbreak and there's only one person who has a lab-confirmed case in your outbreak, there's no point in including that laboratory-confirmed piece in your case definition if you believe that there are other associated cases who do not have laboratory test results. By doing this, you're going to erroneously exclude people from your case-finding efforts and miss people who should be included. There are 2 main goals of the clinical findings piece of the case definition. First, you want the criteria to be as objective as possible. So for example, fever. If you have information on everyone's temperature, you may want to use that in your definition of fever. So here maybe we could say a fever of 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit or more. But you might not have access to that specific temperature information, at which point you may just use the term fever, understanding that this could be really subjective with different people defining it in different ways or even using different measurement tools. So maybe I define fever as anything 99 degrees Fahrenheit or above, but someone else defines fever as anything 101 degrees Fahrenheit and above. So it can make it difficult, and it's not quite as discriminating, but it might be the only information you have. Now, sometimes we'll work to define clinical symptoms in a more objective way, even if we don't have these kind of clinical test results. So one common thing is to describe diarrhea as 3 or more loose stools, which kind of adds a level of detail that is hopefully less subjective than just diarrhea alone, because multiple people might define diarrhea differently. Now, the second goal is for your clinical symptoms to be as discriminating as possible. They should help us differentiate between individuals whose illness is associated with the outbreak and those who have illness that is not associated with the outbreak. So, if we have things like a laboratory diagnosis, we are more confident that a person is linked to the outbreak of salmonella, for example, than if a person just had vomiting and diarrhea, which could be due to many different things. There are standard surveillance definitions provided by CSTE that can serve as a really good starting point when you're considering what clinical findings you want to include in your case definition. Now, you also need to include in your case definition the time periods of interest, the people of interest, and the place of interest. So these are the things that make the definition really specific to the outbreak you're investigating and not just about whether a person has an illness or not. So the first piece is time. We want to look at the time period that's associated with the outbreak. People have diarrhea all the time. We need to restrict the definition to a specific time period so we can narrow it to when we think the outbreak occurred. We don't want cases of diarrhea that people think should be reported if they're not actually associated with our outbreak. For the person piece, we want to restrict to those who we consider to be a case in our outbreak. So for example, if we're looking at an outbreak in a town that is associated with a university, but we're only interested in students or professors of the university, maybe we're not interested in diarrhea cases among family members or roommates of these students or professors, but only among the students and professors. So our goal is to find the cause of the outbreak, not secondary cases that occurred once a case returned home and infected others. Now, while those secondary cases are certainly sick, they were not exposed to the thing we're trying to find. We want to know what the cause of disease was. So this information does not help us identify that original exposure of concern. Now, place could be a geographic reference, often like a state or a town, or if we're able to, it's commonly a specific event or facility. So everyone who attended a birthday party or residents of a nursing home or people who ate at a specific restaurant. So let's look at some real life examples to see these things applied. So this first example is from a cholera outbreak that affected people living in a refugee settlement in western Uganda. In this outbreak, investigators defined a case as a person with acute watery diarrhea in anyone 2 years or older in the Hoima district between February 1st and May 9th, 2018. In this example, cases were identified by reviewing medical records from 2 different cholera treatment centers that conducted active community surveillance in the affected sub-counties to create an updated line list. So here I've highlighted each component of the case definition that we have discussed so far. So in purple, we see clinical findings as acute watery diarrhea. Time in blue was February 1st through May 9th of 2018. Person was identified as anyone 2 years or older in age, and place was the Hoima district in western Uganda. Now note here, this case definition, as we discussed, is presented as a single sentence, not as bullet points. So another example comes from a salmonella outbreak in Ontario, Canada, that was ultimately linked to tofu. So in this investigation, a case was defined as a resident of or visitor to Ontario, Canada, after April 30th, 2021, who was infected with a specific strain of salmonella and had a genomic sequence pattern that was consistent with the outbreak strain. So again, let's look at the different components of the case definition. So in purple, again, we see the clinical findings, which in this case were laboratory testing results. The time was after April 20th, 2021. The person was restricted to someone who was in the location during the time period of interest, and the place was Ontario, Canada. Now, an important thing to notice here is what is not in the case definition, which is the exposure. So we know once this is published that after the outbreak had ended, this MMWR report was published that it found the outbreak was linked to tofu. But remember, during the investigation, our goal is to identify this exposure, so we cannot include it, even if suspected, in the case definition. So the case definition is really a balancing act. You want your definition to be specific enough to identify true cases of disease, people who are really part of the outbreak, but you also want it to be broad enough and sensitive enough that it will identify most, if not all, of the cases associated with your outbreak. So this balance will really impact the investigation and your ability to identify the cause of the outbreak. So let's look at the impact of having a more specific case definition. So having someone who is ill excluded from your case definition is something people can really struggle with. But excluding someone is not bad. We're not denying that they have an illness, that they're sick, that they're experiencing negative symptoms, but we are saying that we're just not confident that their illness is directly linked to the outbreak that we're trying to find the cause of. So let's say in this little rectangle on the left, the people in orange are cases, but we don't actually know that, right, at the beginning of an outbreak. But the orange people are the cases associated with the outbreak, and the blue are not. So let's say we have an outbreak of a GI illness, and all of these people reported some kind of illness. The orange people, we find, all have diarrhea and vomiting. But among the blue people, maybe one has vomiting, one has a headache, one has a fever, one has diarrhea and fever. But you're not really confident that all these blue people have the same illness as the orange people. Now, if we included these blue people in the outbreak, it's going to be much more difficult to identify the cause of the outbreak because all of our people don't actually have something in common. Right, we think they all maybe have a GI illness, but in fact, all their symptoms are not truly the same. So when you work on developing your own case definitions, it can be really tempting to include every single symptom that anyone contacted experienced. So read about the disease that you think is associated with your outbreak and really understand the symptoms and be selective. So one way to think about this is some example where there was an outbreak at a daycare, but our case definition, we excluded siblings of the initial cases in a family if the onset of illness is after the initial case. So this more specific case definition is excluding unrelated cases, letting us be more likely to identify the source, right? So we think maybe there was a food that was consumed at the daycare that got kiddos sick. But we only want to look at those kids who were exposed to that, not the secondary cases when, kiddo goes home with vomiting and diarrhea and gets their siblings sick. And again, we're not denying the sickness of those secondary cases or the illness that they're experiencing, but we are excluding them because we don't believe that they actually had the exposure that we're trying to identify. Now, if you do feel unsure about who should be truly excluded, there is an option for defining various levels of cases, such as probable, suspect, and confirmed, with different levels of certainty. For example, a probable case could be those who have symptoms but no laboratory confirmation of the disease, while a confirmed case could be someone with symptoms as well as laboratory testing. You can later, when you get to your analysis stage, look at all of your cases and then maybe subset and look at just the confirmed cases and see how those results are different. So here's one example of a case definition that includes these kind of levels of certainty. So this was an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease in Napa, California from 2022, where they distinguished between confirmed and suspected cases. So in this outbreak, the investigators defined a confirmed case as having the diagnosis of Legionnaire's disease based on the results of a urinary antigen test, polymerase chain reaction test, or culture received by a person who lived, worked, or spent time in downtown Napa with illness onset during or after June 2022. And then a suspected case was defined as community-acquired pneumonia of unknown origin, identified among 3 categories of persons: a hospitalized patient, a resident of, worker in, or visitor to downtown Napa, or a patient who did not receive testing for Legionella during hospitalization. So note that each of these case definitions still include all 4 key components we discussed earlier: the clinical findings and restrictions by time, person, and place. They just differentiate by their level of certainty of a case. So one other example comes from this really prolonged salmonella outbreak in Michigan that lasted from 2008 to 2019. So in this example, an outbreak case was defined as a case of confirmed salmonella with one of two closely related PFGE patterns, highly related WGS subtype, identified by the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, Bureau of Laboratories, or CDC, or a probable case with clinically compatible illness and epidemiologic linkage to a confirmed case. So while there's a lot of technical stuff in this, basically a confirmed case, right, was someone who had laboratory testing of the strain of salmonella that was associated with this outbreak. But a probable case was someone who had clinically compatible illness, so they had the symptoms linked to salmonella. In your example, we would probably like you to list those, so things like vomiting and diarrhea, and some sort of linkage to a confirmed case. So they had been in the same place, they had shared a meal, whatever, with someone who had already been confirmed. Now, case definitions should change over the course of the outbreak as you just gain more information about both the outbreak and the illness itself. So you may start with cases who maybe only have symptoms, and then as you get more laboratory testing, you might add that laboratory confirmation to your case definition. So let's look at an example. So you'll see that we often begin pretty sensitive in our case definition, and then we become more specific over the course of the investigation. So the example we're going to walk through comes from Boulder in 2008. So in this example, CDPHE was first notified of cases of bloody diarrhea, all that were among students who had attended the same party at CU Boulder during September of 2008. So this first definition included bloody diarrhea among students of CU Boulder in September. Then most cases were tested, as bloody diarrhea is typically an indication for testing, and E. coli 0157 was identified. Now, because there were many cases, not just one or two, identified with this testing, it was appropriate to update the case definition to include this lab result and become more specific. So now we have the case definition as E. coli 0157 in CU Boulder students during September. Now, upon further investigation, this event, this party that was attended by the ill students, we found had been catered by a local restaurant. And in fact, other restaurant patients were also ill with E. coli 0157. So the definition was then no longer restricted to just students. So now the case definition was E. coli 0157 in a patron of the specific restaurant in Boulder during September. So the investigators hypothesized that the outbreak was associated with a food that was actually purchased by the restaurant and was already contaminated when it arrived to the restaurant, rather than being associated with behavior in the kitchen or a cooking issue. So these E. coli 0157 lab samples were then sent for additional subtyping, and it was identified that there was a particular pattern of E. coli 0157. And the investigators then entered that pattern into PulseNet and found that the outbreak was a national outbreak of a specific pattern. So now the case definition changed a final time to be E. coli 0157 with the outbreak strain, the specific pattern, in a person with illness onset in September. And so ultimately, they found out that this was linked to a nationwide romaine lettuce, illness associated with contaminated romaine lettuce. But so here we can see a really good example of the development of a quite local case definition that ended up blossoming into a full multi-state outbreak. So a final note about case definitions is that you should never include the suspected source of the outbreak in the case definition. And I think it can be really tempting, but as epidemiologists, we need to not do that and understand why. So in this last example, you would not include, and you did not see included, romaine lettuce or lettuce anywhere. If we had included that, you're restricting your cases to only people with the exposure, so you can no longer test that hypothesis analytically. So if you all think back to, EPI 101 and our 2x2 tables, if we only have people with the exposure, we have data in those cells A and B, or the top two cells, but the bottom cells are inherently zero because we have no one who doesn't have the exposure. And if half of our cells are zero, we can't calculate something like an odds ratio or a risk ratio. And so we can never really identify that our suspected source is in fact the source of an outbreak. So to summarize some key points about case definitions, any case definition should include 4 key components, being the clinical symptoms and then restrictions by time, person, and place. Now, clinical symptoms are limited to the information that you have available, but should be as objective and discriminating as possible based on the information available. Now, you just have to find the balance between sensitivity and specificity, but do not be afraid to exclude people whose illness you're not confident aligns with the illness of the outbreak. You can create separate definitions for confirmed and probable or suspect cases. However, this isn't super common in small outbreaks, especially like small point source outbreaks, maybe linked to a very specific food. But in a larger, maybe national or multi-state outbreak, these distinctions can be appropriate. Case definitions will evolve as you learn more about the outbreak and the illness. So now that we've discussed case definitions, you should move on to watch the lecture about descriptive epidemiology, and that will help prepare you for this week's assignment.